Some cases never leave you. They burrow under your skin, fester like an infection. The Mercer case was mine. 10 years ago, I stood in the basement of a derelict house at the edge of town, my flashlight sweeping across the walls. What I saw still clings to me, a grotesque gallery of horror. Human faces, dozens of them, stretched and tanned into crude masks. Some are mounted like hunting trophies, others draped over crude mannequins. Eyeholes gaped like empty sockets, their expressions frozen in silent screams. Nathaniel Mercer had been meticulous. The stitching was precise, the preservation flawless. Each mask was a testament to his craft. A man who didn't just kill, he collected. And when we followed the trail back to him, we found the son of a respected MP standing in the middle of his family's lavish estate, staring at us as if we were the monsters. But justice was never served. His father pulled the right strings, made the right threats. The case was closed before the ink had dried on the reports. The masks were destroyed. The victims' families never got closure. And Mercer himself? Gone. No trial, no prison sentence, just a loose end swept under the rug. I should have let it go. But then the body surfaced. The news broke at dawn. A woman, flayed with surgical precision, dumped outside an abandoned factory. The skin of her face was gone. It wasn't just another murder. It was a signature, a message. I forced myself to look at the crime scene photos, the familiar pattern of incisions, the methodical way the skin had been removed. The killer knew what he was doing. It was Mercer's work, or at least someone who studied him closely enough to replicate it. But Mercer had vanished a decade ago. If he was alive, why return now? I spent the morning combing through the details, searching for anything out of place. The victim, a woman in her late 20s, last seen 2 nights ago leaving a bar downtown. No obvious connection to the original case. The cut marks, the flaying technique, it was almost identical to Mercer's work. Almost. The difference was subtle, but I saw it. The way the edges of the missing face had been treated, the small inconsistencies in the incisions. Mercer had been surgical. This was practiced, but not his work. A copycat. That should have been a relief. It wasn't. If someone was reviving the legend of the skin collector, it meant they wanted to continue it, to become it, or worse, to bring him back. I knew where I had to start. The house where we found Mercer's collection had been boarded up after the investigation, condemned, then quietly sold. Someone owned it now, someone who had either ignored its history or knew it too well. I drove out to the old property, the road still cracked and uneven, lined with skeletal trees. The house stood at the end of the long drive, weathered but intact. A single light glowed in one of the windows. Someone was there. I didn't expect to find answers on my first visit, but I did expect the house to be silent, empty. Instead, I heard it as soon as I stepped out of the car. A slow, rhythmic creak, a sound that sent a deep, primal unease through me. Someone was rocking. I moved cautiously, my footsteps crunching over dead leaves. The porch groaned under my weight. The front door was locked, but a side window was open just enough for me to slip inside. The air was stale, thick with something sickly sweet. I knew that smell. It was the smell of decay masked by something stronger. Formaldehyde. I forced myself forward. The house had been gutted since the original investigation, the basement sealed off. Whoever lived here had tried to erase what happened, but something told me the past refused to stay buried. The creaking sound grew louder as I stepped down the hall. A chair, rocking back and forth in the dim glow of a single lamp, and in it an old man. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his skull. He was looking at something in his lap, fingers caressing it absently. He didn't seem to notice me. And then I saw it. A mask. A human face, folded and softened with age. It sat across his knees, its hollow eyes staring into the void. I stepped closer, my throat dry. He kept rocking, his breath slow and rattling. He hadn't bought the house to forget. He had bought it to remember. I turned away before he could speak, before I could ask him where he got it. I already knew. There was another name I needed to see. Nathaniel Mercer's father. The man who had made this all disappear 10 years ago. If Mercer wasn't back, someone was keeping his legacy alive. And I needed to find out why before another body was found. before another face disappeared into a new collection. The dead don't whisper, but their absence does. I spent the next few days buried in old case files, tracing the cracks that had formed in the Mercer investigation. The official records were clean, too clean. Everything about his arrest, the discovery of his hideout, the testimonies of those involved had been sanitized. The photographs of the masks were gone. The written reports remained, but they were sterile, clinical, stripped of anything that would bring the horror of the case back to life. It was like someone had taken a scalpel to the truth, slicing away every detail that mattered. The families of the victims were no help. The few who answered my calls refused to speak. Some hung up the moment I said my name. Others told me, in uncertain, trembling voices, that they had already suffered enough. One woman, the sister of a man whose face had been found among Mercer's collection, refused to open the door when I knocked. Through the peephole, I could see her shadow, frozen, waiting for me to leave. The unspoken message was clear. They were still afraid. The deeper I dug, the more names disappeared. The coroner who had examined the bodies, Dr. Lewis Grant, had left his position at the morgue a year after the case was closed. No forwarding address, no employment records. It was as if he had never existed. The officers who had been at the crime scene had either transferred or resigned within months. One had drowned in a boating accident. Another had been found in a motel room, a gun in his hand, no note. One by one, the people who had been closest to the case had been erased. And then came the message. It was waiting for me when I returned to my office. A single sheet of paper slipped under the door. No envelope, no signature. Just 7 words, printed in bold, uneven ink. You should have left it buried. The weight of it settled deep in my chest. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Someone knew I was digging. Someone wanted me to keep going. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words until they blurred. There was something I had missed. Something about Mercer himself. Nathaniel Mercer had never been declared dead. I hadn't noticed before, too focused on the brutality of his crimes to consider what had happened after his arrest. The official documents never said he had died or escaped. There had been no funeral, no record of a prison sentence. Instead, there was a single transfer order. A name I hadn't seen before. Blackridge Psychiatric Institute. A private facility, one of those quiet places where wealthy families sent their inconvenient secrets. The kind of place where a man like Mercer could be hidden, studied, kept out of the public eye. The date on the file was 6 months after the case was closed. It was the last official record of his existence. The problem was Blackridge no longer existed. It had burned down 5 years ago. A fire in the middle of the night, no survivors. According to the reports, all patients and staff had perished. The cause had never been determined. Another loose end. I found myself staring at the message again. The ink was smudged at the edges, as if written in a hurry. Someone had gone to the trouble of finding me, slipping it under my door. They hadn't left a name. They hadn't given me a warning. They had invited me deeper. I checked the time. Midnight. The city outside my window was quiet, the hum of traffic distant. The air in my office felt heavy, stagnant. I reached for the case files again, flipping through the pages until I found Mercer's last known photograph. The mugshot had always unsettled me. He hadn't looked afraid or remorseful. He had looked interested, like the whole thing was just another layer of skin he could slip into. His lips had been pressed together, but the corners of his mouth had twitched just slightly, like he knew something I didn't. I let the photograph fall onto my desk. Mercer had disappeared. Blackridge had burned. The people closest to the case had either vanished or ended up dead. None of it was coincidence. Someone wanted me to find Mercer. Or worse, someone wanted me to replace him. The second body surfaced in an alley behind a condemned motel. The rain had washed away most of the blood, but not the horror. The flaying was methodical, as precise as before, but there was something different. Something missing. The face. Not just the skin, but everything beneath it. The bone, the cartilage gone. Where there should have been a skull, there was only a ragged, empty cavity, the muscles severed with surgical precision. The coroner's report confirmed it. The victim's entire face had been removed, but unlike Mercer's usual pattern, there was no mask left behind. No preserved trophy. No grotesque display. It wasn't a collection. It was a theft. Someone wasn't just taking faces. They were using them. That thought lingered with me as I drove home that night, rain smearing the streetlights into liquid ghosts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The way headlights in the rearview mirror seemed too steady, too intent. The way the shadows stretched unnaturally as I passed under flickering lamps. I changed my route twice, took unnecessary turns, doubled back. The car behind me never faltered. When I finally pulled into a side street, killing the engine, I caught a glimpse of the driver in the reflection of a rain-slicked window. Tall, lean, a certain stiffness to the posture, like someone trying to move naturally and failing. The familiarity sent a sickness curling through my stomach. It was him, Nathaniel Mercer. It had to be. The moment I turned to get a clearer look, he was already moving. A flicker of motion, a dark silhouette slipping between alleys. My instinct screamed to stay in the car, to call someone, anyone, but I was already moving, drawn into the chase before my mind could stop me. I followed him through the narrow corridors of the city, through streets that reeked of stagnant water and decay. His movements were calculated, deliberate, leading me deeper into the maze of abandoned buildings and forgotten pathways. The city felt emptied, as if the entire world had pulled away, leaving only us. Then he turned a corner, and by the time I reached it, nothing. A dead end. A wall slick with grime, a rusted fire escape above. No doors, no way out. And yet he was gone. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I stood there for too long, listening to the sound of my own breath, waiting for something to move in the shadows. Nothing did. I wasn't alone. I knew that much. I left before I could prove myself right. By the time I reached my office, exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead. The door was unlocked. My fingers hesitated over the handle before pushing it open. The dim glow of my desk lamp was the only light in the room. Something sat in the center of my desk. A package, brown paper tied with twine, damp at the edges, as if it had been left in the rain. I stepped forward, already knowing I shouldn't, already knowing what I would find. The twine came undone easily. The paper peeled away. Inside, the leather was old, stretched, shrunken with age. The texture was unmistakable. Human skin, preserved. A face, not the one from the latest murder. Not something fresh, something older. I knew the contours of it. The faint scar along the cheekbone. The way the skin had been tanned, cured to prevent decay. It was from the last victim I had investigated before the case was buried. A woman whose face had been missing for a decade. And on the inside, carved into the flesh with careful, deliberate strokes. My name. The nausea came first, then the understanding. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't a message. This was a fitting. Someone had measured me for my own skin. Some men are untouchable, not because of their strength, but because of the power that shields them. Lionel Mercer was one of those men. He had built a wall of influence around himself so thick that even justice couldn't break through. 10 years ago, he made his son's crimes disappear. Now, I needed to know if he had done the same with his son. His house was an estate, a sprawling relic of wealth, set apart from the world by high iron gates and towering hedges. A place where sins could be buried deep, beyond the reach of law or consequence. I didn't expect him to talk. I expected deflection, arrogance, maybe even threats. But what I got was something else. Fear. He tried to mask it with composure, but I saw the tremor in his fingers, the way his throat tightened when I spoke his son's name. He had buried Mercer once, sealed him away where no one could find him. But now, something had gone wrong. He wouldn't admit it, wouldn't let the truth slip past his lips, but I could see it in his eyes. The truth had escaped. I left him with more questions than answers, but something had shifted. The careful balance he had maintained for years was crumbling. And then the tape surfaced. I didn't know who sent it. No return address, no name. Just a small, unmarked package left in my office while I was gone. Inside was a single flash drive. The footage was grainy, distorted by smoke and failing security cameras. A long hallway, walls blackened with soot, emergency lights flickering. Figures moved in the chaos, patients, staff, some running, some collapsing. The fire had already spread, consuming the asylum in waves of heat and shadow. And then, there he was, Nathaniel Mercer. He stepped through the smoke like it wasn't even there, his movements calm, controlled. His hospital gown was pristine, untouched by the flames. In his arms, something wrapped in cloth, cradled like an offering. He walked straight through the chaos, past burning doorways, past the bodies. No one stopped him. No one even seemed to see him. And then he was gone. The camera feed cut out. The last doctor to see Mercer alive had disappeared after the fire. His name was in the records, but no one had heard from him since. Another loose end tied off too neatly. The asylum was supposed to be his grave, but the footage told a different story. He had walked out of the fire, whole, untouched, carrying something that mattered more than the flames around him. He had never been buried. That night, I locked every door, checked every window twice. The city outside my apartment felt distant, unreal. The glow of streetlights through the curtains did nothing to push back the weight of knowing. I slept lightly, uneasy in my own skin. Sometime in the night, I woke without knowing why. The room was silent, but something had changed. The air felt wrong. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding. The darkness seemed thicker, pressing in from all sides. The apartment was the same, but not. It took me too long to notice the mirrors. Every reflective surface was covered. Sheets, newspaper, black cloth. My bathroom mirror, the glass on my coffee table, even my laptop screen, hidden, smothered, except for one. The mirror in my bedroom stood uncovered, fully exposed. A mask was nailed to it. The skin was aged, yellowed at the edges. It sagged where the nails pierced through, holding it in place like something crucified. It took me a second too long to realize what was wrong. The reflection behind the mask was missing. My own image, my own face gone, as if it had already been taken. As if the mask was waiting for something, or someone. Somewhere between truth and madness, I lost myself. The mask nailed to my mirror had been an invitation, a silent promise of what was to come. Mercer had been watching, waiting. He had given me the evidence I needed, guiding me toward a single, inevitable conclusion. This had never been about finding him. It had been about leading me to him. And I followed. The old hideout was still standing. A derelict shell of a house, its walls rotting, its secrets buried in dust and time. It was a place where Mercer had been exposed, where his trophies had been found, stretched and distorted into the grotesque relics of his craft. It was where he would return. I made sure of it. A message left where he would see it. A simple, undeniable invitation. He had left masks for me. This time, I left something for him. A single mirror, uncovered, waiting. The house was silent when I arrived. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something else, something rancid, just beneath the surface. The boards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. The basement door yawned open, its darkness swallowing the weak light filtering through the broken windows. And then I heard it, the sound of something heavy shifting against the floor, a dragging, muffled movement, the rasp of fabric against skin. He was here, but he wasn't alone. The figure in the center of the room was bound, gagged, slumped forward in a chair that hadn't been there before. The ropes cut deep into the flesh of his wrists, his breathing ragged beneath the sack over his head. His father, the man who had buried his crimes, who had ensured that his son walked free, erased from public memory. But Mercer hadn't come for revenge. He had come for recognition. The truth settled over me like a dead weight, sinking deep into my bones. This wasn't a son confronting his father. This was an apprentice returning to his master. Lionel Mercer hadn't covered up his son's crimes. He had created them. Nathaniel Mercer was never the first collector. He was only the latest in a legacy built in blood and skin. The real killer had never been caught because no one had ever looked in the right place. Mercer's trophies, his craft, his art, it had been taught, refined, and now, the final piece of his collection was waiting. Me. The realization came too late. Mercer moved like a shadow, his steps soundless against the concrete floor. I turned, reaching for my weapon, but he was already there. The knife in my hand met flesh, but not his own. The skin peeled away too easily. A loose thing, slipping under my fingers. The face that fell into my hands wasn't his. It was a mask. The person I had been chasing, the figure who had led me here. It wasn't Mercer at all. It had been someone wearing Mercer. And then he stepped out of the shadows. The real Nathaniel Mercer. His face was a patchwork of stolen identities, sewn together with cruel precision. The skin of different victims stretched over his bones, their features twisted into something no longer human. He had been collecting for years, becoming something more than a single man. And now, he was ready for his final masterpiece. I felt the steel before I saw it. Cold, unforgiving, sliding against the skin of my throat. A whisper of pressure, just enough to let me know what was coming. Mercer leaned in close. I was always meant to be his greatest work. Then, darkness. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something faintly metallic, like old blood soaked too deep into the walls to ever be scrubbed away. The detective lay in the bed, motionless, his face wrapped in gauze, the bandages tight against his swollen features. The news had called it a miracle. A man found barely alive in the basement of an abandoned house, his body marked by deep lacerations, his skin marred as if someone had tried to carve him apart and failed. No identification, no memory. Just an empty name attached to a broken man. A rookie investigator had taken an interest in the case, drawn in by the grotesque details, the eerie familiarity of it all. The murders had begun again, echoing a decade-old nightmare that was never truly put to rest. The name Nathaniel Mercer had surfaced once more, a legend whispered among those who had tried to forget. And yet, the man responsible had supposedly been stopped. The detective was a survivor, but something was wrong. The doctor said he didn't remember anything before waking up in the hospital. No recollection of who he was, no memories of the night he was found. The injuries were severe, but nothing explained the depth of his confusion. The way he touched his own face as if it wasn't his, the way he stared too long at the mirror across the room, unblinking. They had brought in forensic specialists, old colleagues, anyone who could help him remember. But the detective never reacted, never recognized anyone. It was as if the man who had woken up in that hospital bed wasn't the same person who had disappeared. The investigator reviewing the case pushed further, determined to connect the scattered pieces. The final police reports, the medical records, something didn't fit. And then came the detail that changed everything. A victim was missing. The bodies found in Mercer's hideout had been accounted for, all but one. The skin had been removed so cleanly, so perfectly, that it had been impossible to identify. The face had never been recovered. The investigator returned to the hospital, uneasy now, the weight of something terrible pressing down. The detective was still there, sitting upright, his hands folded too carefully in his lap, his breathing too measured. The bandages had been removed. His face was healed, and yet the expression was off. The way the skin settled just slightly wrong, the way the eyes gleamed, not with confusion, but with something else. Something knowing, something hungry. The detective had been found alive, but the man in that bed wasn't him at all. It was Nathaniel Mercer, wearing his skin. And now he was free,